Hey everyone. Um, we're gonna do a little whisper reading. Sorry, it's been a little while since I've been here. I've got like a setup, so I'm like talking out the side of my mouth here. Anyway, I'm gonna read my book, so I'm pretty excited about that. For those of you that have joined my list, thank you so much. However, check your spam and your promotions folder on Gmail because there's a lot of people that did not confirm. So this whole time you're supposed to be getting emails, but if you don't confirm to the list, then you won't get any of them. So double check your spam and Google promotions folder. So as of right now, and my wife says I needed to make this video. Man, I think I angled the camera too much. Let's do it a little. We'll leave it. Is what it is. I just won't look at the camera that much. My wife told me I needed to get on this and do this. So we are reading Soulless Wanderers by Drew Strickland. Yeah, that's totally me. If anyone is interested, the link will be in the description. And for the next couple of days, it is only 99 cents, or the equivalent to wherever you are located. Feel free not to buy it if you're not interested, that's fine. But for those that are, there it is. Otherwise, let's just whisper read for your relaxation. Alright, we're pretty good here. It's a little different setup because I didn't want to be whatever. Okay. I'll just start at the beginning. I'm not going to read the whole thing. That's going to take forever. I'm just going to do a little bit at a time. Thanks. Killing someone was easy. It was the prep work leading up to the kill that was most difficult. Daniel crouched in the dimly lit hallway, his arms stretched under the shelving unit in front of him, straining to pull out the box he had planted there earlier in the day. He finally pulled it out, relieving the fight his arms were dealing with, and stood up, holding it against his body. The dust he kicked up reached his nose, giving him a tingle sensation. He paused, waiting for the need to sneeze to pass. It did, and he continued toward the source of light, a lone light bulb swaying in the concrete shaft. He reached the door and put his shoulder into it, opening it with a creak. The light in the next room was much brighter. It was a small work light, which looked inadequate, but put enough light to fill the room. He needed it for the work he was to do that night. Every moment went into planning tonight, and he wouldn't let something as simple as lighting stop him. Most of the lights were burned out or broken from kids breaking in. Excuse me. The power was still connected to the rundown building, which is why Daniel picked it. He set the dusty box down on a table next to a small television. He clicked the TV on, and the glow from the screen lit his face up. It was mostly a clear picture, but he adjusted the rabbit ears of the antenna anyway, causing a little fuzz to move in and out. The news was on. A countdown clock was in the corner as the lady news anchor spoke. We are minutes away from the big show tonight. I urge anyone watching this to go outside and get near a window and watch the sky. This will not happen again for another 500 years, according to historical evidence. Just so you know, I'm not the best reader, so if I mess up, it's not the text. Daniel smiled and looked up. There was a skylight above him. Tonight's event seemed like a great time to perform his own event. He knew this building would come in handy sometime, and he was glad he hadn't used it yet. Tonight would be perfect. Besides, it seemed like a nice idea to let someone else witness it before they took their last breath. Or maybe during their last breath. Daniel hadn't figured it out yet, but he knew that the time would feel just right. He took out a large knife from the box and carried it to the other side of the dusty room. He laid it neatly on the end of the table as it shook. It was easy for him to drown out the muffled cries coming from the man strapped to the table. This wasn't his first time, and it was almost a soothing rhythm when the person tried Daniel knew nobody would be looking for him. Most people were preoccupied with tonight's event. Even if they weren't, this building was abandoned years ago, and he knew this man's history. He lived with nobody. Man, I picked like a day that I'm having my son's got a cold and I'm worried I'm coming down with it. Anyway, he lived with nobody. He didn't show up to work. Nobody would care. Call centers have people abandon their jobs on a daily basis, only to be replaced by the next lifeless face that can hold a phone. The man had no family, and unless you consider the bartender at the nearby shithole bar, he had no friends. Daniel had done his research, and this man was nobody. Daniel picked up the knife and put a finger against his own lips. The man seemed not still shaking. Daniel grabbed at the tape covering the man's mouth and ripped it off in one fluid motion. The sound of the duct tape pulling across his face echoed in the room. The man let out a yelp but seemed preoccupied with his situation to register the pain. Who are you? Oh. The man stumbled with his words. He opened his mouth again. You don't know me. I'm not anyone you've seen before, or anyone your friends know. I just am, Daniel replied. Although it may have seemed he was being mysterious, it was his usual reply in this situation. Anything more direct didn't seem to register with anyone. They still couldn't understand why this was happening to them. Why? The man managed to squeak out. Daniel smiled wide. This was his favorite. The why was much more fun than the who or where. Because I can. Because you were the perfect fit for Daniel. Daniel pointed to himself with a knife. When he said this, when he was Daniel, it was something pure. He could release himself fully and truly. Daniel White was something ancient inside him, almost biblical in a sense. Not the other guy, the one everyone saw on a daily basis. Danny. Sure, Danny was acceptable by everyone's standards. He had developed himself over the years to be so, took every little thing he said and examined it with everyone's reactions to make sure he was behaving accordingly. He tried to sneak as much of Daniel out, but could barely scratch the surface. It wasn't just because Daniel would be completely out of place and misunderstood by society. In fact, he could let Daniel loose at moments and get away with it completely. Like the time in the coffee shop where the guy was taking too long with his order and rubbed everyone the wrong way. Daniel made a spectacle out of him, and everyone cheered. It felt amazing. The problem with letting Daniel out in his day-to-day life was that the more he got away with it, the more he wanted to do it. The more Daniel would slip out in situations that weren't acceptable. He couldn't let that happen. He had worked so hard to get where he was, just to enjoy moments like these. A man strapped to his table, fearing for his life, completely at Daniel's control. Under his knife, his breath short but heavy at the same time, his sweat seeping from his pores, the blood pumping in his veins, just waiting to be let out all over the floor. Daniel, you don't have to do this, the man said, crying. The saliva from his mouth was sticking to his lips in strings as he pleaded. That's true, I don't, but I want to. Daniel can't be swayed. Daniel got up close to the man's face, letting his breath land against his cheek in hot waves. I've waited too long for this. Daniel stood up and looked at the television. was one of these kids' parents calling him up and complaining that their kid wasn't being washed and was injured. He stepped toward the boys and grabbed the one on top, pulling at his shirt. "Oh, come on, Pastor Bale," the one on top pleaded. Yeah, it's cool. We're just messing around," the one who had been flipped said, standing up as the other was pulling off him, or as the other was pulled off him. Paxton let go of the kid's shirt and watched them both dust themselves off. "Come on, guys, it's just a few more minutes," Paxton said, glad everyone was okay. Some grumbling and laughs were met with his intervention, but Paxton was glad the crowd dispersed and no more roughhousing commenced. He may have overreacted, but he didn't want to take any chances. He knew everyone was friends and having a good time, but he didn't want to let anything get out of hand. He smiled as he watched the majority of the group gather around, while some of their friends started strumming on guitars. There had to be at least 50 kids out there tonight. It was the perfect night to gather, perfect weather, great friends, and open eyes ready for the night event that wouldn't be seen for who knows how many more lifetimes. He was happy he could lead the youth group to celebrate the Lord tonight. He was also happy that so many youths could come together and not be ashamed or embarrassed to show their love for Jesus. Paxton swept his slightly unkempt hair from his eyes as he watched Manny cross the field. Manny was the maintenance guy that was at the church probably more often than he needed to. Paxton figured he appreciated the job, or maybe didn't have much to go home to, but he was always a hit with the kids. The high fives Manny received from the number of kids on his walk proved that point even more. "Manny," the shouts from multiple kids echoed across the field. Manny held up his hand in appreciation as if he was some sort of celebrity. Paxton laughed at the older guy as he went up to him. "What's funny, boss?" Manny asked, referring to everyone that worked at the church as boss, whether or not they really were. "Just you. I spend all my time and energy trying to build up a relationship with the kids and gain their trust, as you've gained twice as much as I have. Oh, I skipped a line. And respect, all you have to do is walk across the field, and you've gained twice as much as I have." Paxton wasn't really jealous. It was just a genuine observation. "Nah, man, you gotta be yourself. These kids are just like you or me, just less experienced. You're the one they really looked up to. You guide them to show them how much better they can be. I'm just the guy who cleans the toilets and fixes the sound system while speaking the language, you know. You really make the difference." Paxton liked Manny. He didn't know his background, but figured it had something to do with prison. The teardrop tattoo on his face had a little to do with it, even though it shamed Paxton to think so. Don't judge a book and all that, but sometimes it was easy to do so. "You have kids at home?" It was an innocent question posed by Manny, but one that stung Paxton deeper than it should have. He smiled and shook his head. "No, I don't." "Shame. I've got 5 and they always keep you grounded, you know." Paxton wished he did know. It wasn't for lack of trying, but it just wasn't meant to be. The Lord decided it wasn't for his path. Once the doctor said that his wife wasn't a good candidate for him for in vitro, they decided to give up on the dream. That was when he decided to get involved more heavily in the youth program at church and worked his way into the lead youth pastor position. It felt like he was influencing all these kids' lives and putting his own stamp on their futures. Paxton stood in silence for longer than probably appropriate, and he figured Manny could pick it up on it. "So what do you need, Manny?" he said, finally clearing his throat. "I'm working on getting those chairs and extra blankets out for you, but I need your hand with them. Can you and the other guys help me?" Paxton surveyed the group. He knew they were good kids, but with 50 of them left on their own, even for a few minutes, it would be a recipe for disaster. He motioned to Frank, a heavy-set bearded man in a polo shirt. He always volunteered for these events with the high schoolers. Frank caught the signal and put himself into a jog towards Paxton. "What's up?" Frank asked, already out of breath. "I need you and Tom over there to keep an eye on the kids. I'm going to help Manny with the blankets." Frank looked over at Tom. He was a balding man and the junior youth pastor. He was cracking jokes with some of the senior boys. "Yeah, no problem, man. You sure you don't need a hand? I'll grab a couple of the boys to help me. Maybe I should put them all to work. Let us old guys take a break, right?" Paxton nudged Frank. "Sure thing. Just let me know when you become one of the old guys." Frank was obviously right. Paxton was in his late 30s, while the other 2 men were at least 10 years his senior. Paxton shrugged and left Frank with a pat on his shoulder. Lead the way, Manny. Two boys looking to be juniors or seniors in high school accompanied Paxton and Manny into the gym of the church. The chairs were still lined up facing the stage that was set in the back of the building. Usually, they held a worship service Wednesday nights and Sunday mornings for the youth group, unless there was some sort of special event or camp they were hiding. Tonight was one of those situations. Manny hefted piles of blankets into the corner of the room and handed them off to Paxton, who then handed them to Jeff, the first of the two boys. Jeff began the walk across the gym to the metal doors. Paxton was handed another pile and held them out to Kyle. Kyle's hand grazed Paxton's wrist where his watch was, catching on the broken clasp, and suddenly Kyle pulled back, grabbing at his hand. Paxton could feel it. Blood began to pool from the small drips that fell on the ground. Even with Kyle holding his hand tight, the blood managed to find a way through. Paxton grabbed his own wrist and could feel the jagged piece on his watch. It was a broken fitted metal band that had done the damage. He had thought about getting a new watch, or at the very least getting rid of the watch he had, but it was an anniversary gift from his wife and wasn't so easy to get rid of. Shit, it cut pretty bad, Kyle said between clenched teeth. Hey, I know it hurts, but you're still in the Lord's house here. Watch the language, Paxton replied. Sorry, Pastor Bale. It's okay, Kyle. Why don't you head to the bathroom and get it cleaned up? I'll see if I can get the first aid kit and get you a Band-Aid. Kyle nodded and headed to the bathroom across the gym. Paxton decided to take the load of blankets himself and made for the same way Jeff went. Paxton could see the door beginning to close, so he picked up his pace so he didn't have to open it again. Just as Paxton was able to put his foot in the doorway to prevent the door from closing, the door swung wide open. Jeff ran directly into Paxton, knocking them both to the ground, blankets flying everywhere. Paxton was disoriented from the tumble, but Jeff grabbed his collar. Jeff was panicked and not making sense. Between gasps for air, he was able to speak. Run. I don't know. Just get up. Chapter 2. Yeah, that was one chapter. There were like two little splits, but Daniel could hear the scream stop. What he heard next sounded like grumbling or moaning between wet smacks. It struck him as strange, but figured everyone had a different reaction when in shock. It's just that most of the time people would cry, get angry, or even burst into nervous laughter when faced with the idea of their own death. He had yet to hear someone sound like they were uncontrollably hungry or even animalistic. He shrugged as he picked up the extension cord. The first thing he noticed was the news. It seemed as if something had happened that wasn't supposed to happen. The clock was still counting down, but the lady on the television wasn't talking about it anymore. There was no excitement, only confusion and disbelief. But disbelief in what? Standing over the man on his table was very different. The man no longer looked confused or scared. He wasn't even really angry. His mouth was chomping while saliva flung from his lips. Daniel looked at the man as he was trying to sit up. The restraints prevented this, but there was no energy lost in trying. Daniel got close and looked directly into the man's eyes. It was as if nothing was there. Sure, he had pupils and color was still there, but it was hard for Daniel to admit, due to mostly a lack of belief. It was as if he had no soul behind his eyes. Daniel picked up the knife, watching the man, or whatever he was now, struggle. He looked at the television, seeing the clock finally hit 0. Nobody on the screen seemed to notice or care. People rushed around, not caring about being on the camera in the news station. Instead, they were too busy scrambling in confusion, trying to reach anybody on the scene. Daniel looked up at the sky and saw nothing. No lights, no comet, no anything other than the night sky above him. Finally on the screen, the news anchor looked at the camera. I don't know what's happening. We aren't getting much information from anyone out in the field, and our cameras witnessed the event. It looks like it came early. Let's cut to Paul outside if he's still out there. The camera cut to the outdoor shot of the sky. Moans could be heard in the background. After a few seconds, the camera fell to the ground, showing a view of random people shuffling around with no real direction. Paul, the obvious news reporter in his suit and earpiece, came into view. He looked like the man on the table. No life in his eyes and an animalistic mouth smacking. Someone stepped into view. This person was different. He looked tired and had few seconds before the picture cut to a pre-recorded interview with the fire department. Daniel turned the television off and looked back down to the struggling thing on the table. He unceremoniously plunged the knife into its chest. Normally he would have relished in the act, but he was caught in a strange moment of information he didn't expect to be receiving. Something weird was happening. He watched as the man struggled and waited for him to die. After a few minutes of watching with no change in the man's mood, he pulled the knife out and plunged it in his chest multiple times. So many times, in fact, that he was winded after doing it. Nothing. No change. This thing was not letting up. He picked up a large piece of rebar that some kid had torn out of the wall at some point in the building's history of decay. He normally wouldn't have done something so reckless, but he figured there was nothing more to lose. He wailed on the body, and the more he pounded, the harder his next swing was. He could hear the cracking of the bones splitting in the body. Finally, he fell to the floor in a mess of sweat and exhaustion. The body still moved. It still tried to get up, only this time it was able to get his arm loose. Daniel had hit it so hard that the bones had snapped in half, making them look like jello sliding from restraints. Daniel sat next to the table, catching his breath when the body fell on top of him. His face lined up with the smacking lips and chomping jaws of the monster before him. He quickly reacted and grabbed its neck and dangled upside down in front of him. Fortunately, Daniel hadn't broken its ankles or feet, and its legs were still restrained. He felt around, trying to grab something that could help him. Nothing was on the floor nearby, so he lifted his hand up and felt the table. The knife slipped into his hand, its grip familiar and warm. He quickly stabbed it down from the table directly into the monster's cheek and through its skull. The life, or whatever was left inside of the thing, was gone. It dangled lifelessly and held heavy from the table. Daniel pushed over and crawled out from under it. He began to head out of the building, not caring about the body or his setup. Whatever was happening didn't just happen here, and he had to get out of here. Even if there wasn't something strange going on, nobody would be looking for the man. The only worry Daniel would have was if somebody stumbled upon his kill scene. The way the news left it, he figured nobody would care. Either way, it was more important for him to get out of there and get north. Daniel got in his car and drove down the road. He didn't know if he had ever really felt panic before, but figured that whatever he was feeling was the closest he may ever get. I think the next chapter, or the next portion of this chapter is a little bit longer, and well, alright, we'll do it, just for you guys. I gotta get going soon. Paxton stumbled, trying to get up from the floor. The blankets piled around him made it difficult to move. He felt like he was swimming in fabric. Finally, he was able to make his way to his feet and reach down to help Jeff up. Jeff took his hand and was hoisted up, still panicked. Okay, what's going on? Paxton asked, trying to assess the situation. The situation. I just said it says situation. A sporadic banging began on the hard metal door that Jeff just ran through. Paxton reached for the door, but Jeff grabbed his arm. Jeff, this isn't funny. I don't know if you and your friends are trying to. Jeff grabbed his hair and pulled in frustration. No, I swear it. I went outside. Something seemed off, but I saw Bobby. Paxton nodded, knowing Bobby himself. He was a good, reliable kid who wasn't known for his popularity, but was every other kid's go-to guy when they needed help. I was going to hand the blankets off to him, but when he turned around, he wasn't there, you know. Paxton shook his head. I have no idea what you're saying, Jeff. Why don't we go outside and ask everyone? They're probably trying to pull off some elaborate prank, and I'm really close to thinking you're in on it. Paxton pushed the door open before Jeff could do anything about it. Immediately, Jeff ran when he saw his peers in the doorway. Paxton watched as Bobby stumbled forward through the doorway. Jeff hadn't been lying. There was something off with him, but he figured it when pressured, Bobby would give up the charade and own up to the prank. Paxton grabbed Bobby's shoulder and started with a smile. Bobby, you've got Jeff really freaked out. Nah, I'm still not sure if he's in on this whole thing, but either way, we don't have much time and have to get outside before it's too late. Paxton waited as Bobby looked at him with a strange unfamiliarity. showed signs of feeling pain. Some of them tried to get up, while others took to crawling and reached for Paxton's legs. Paxton watched as Bobby's mouth hovered over his own hand. He winced, hoping the pain wouldn't come. It didn't. Paxton opened his eyes with a loud grunt came over his shoulder. He watched a large pole hit Bobby in the face. A quick glance over his shoulder let him know that Manny was there. He had the rail from the storage room they used to hang costumes and baptism outfits on. Paxton was released from Bobby's grip. He stumbled backward and fell on his backside. He watched as Bobby's body did the same thing. He was in a sort of trance as he watched Bobby stumble backward and hit his head against the wall. It didn't seem to faze the boy at all. He began to get up, but what shocked Paxton the most wasn't the sudden stamina that Bobby seemed to have. It was his jaw. When Manny had swung the pole across his face, it had broken part of it. It dangled to the side in a crumpled mess. However, Bobby went right back to it. He still got up. He still walked haphazard-like forward. He still chomped and smacked as much as his jaw would let him. Paxton could have sat there in fascination waiting for Bobby and the others to reach him, but he felt a strong hand on his shoulder. Manny hoisted him to his feet. "What is going on?" Paxton managed to mumble. Manny shook his head. "No idea, boss. I don't think we should stick around to find out, though," the maintenance man said, letting his accent sleep through. Paxton nodded at the man's words. Both of them headed to the other side of the large open gym as the teenagers' monsters began to fill it. Paxton looked over his shoulder and watched the bathroom door open. They had forgotten about Kyle. His eyes lit up at the sight of all his peers wandering around in trance. "What's going on?" he asked with a laugh. "Kyle," Paxton yelled, "get away from them." It was the most he could do with little notice. The monsters were so close, nearly surrounding the bathroom door now. "I don't..." Kyle began to say, but was cut off when a girl grabbed his arm. It could have been Andrea, or possibly Megan, by the look of her hair. Paxton was too far away to be sure. But either way, my phone's blowing up. But either way, it didn't matter. Her mouth was smacking and chomping just like Bobby's was. Kyle pulled away, but she was too strong. "We have to help him," Paxton said. Oh, I've got like way too much space. Sorry, guys. Not the best crop. I should put a picture back there. "We have to help him," Paxton said, more asking permission from Manny than a statement. Manny shook his head and pointed. Yeah, I'm gonna move the camera now. That's better. Just in the middle of the video, just gonna move the camera. "We have to help him," Paxton said, more asking permission from Manny than a statement. Manny shook his head and pointed. It was too late. More of them came and pushed into Kyle. He stumbled backward, still gripped by the girl. He went into the bathroom screaming as the girl and a few more of them followed. The door closed, and all that was left were a few screams from Kyle, and then nothing. Paxton stood in despair, listening to one of the kids he was supposed to be in charge of, to make sure he stayed safe, meet his demise in a bathroom by the jaws of his peers that had now turned into monsters. It really brought reality to a screaming halt. "Come on," Manny said, snapping Paxton out of it. The two men headed to the doors at the other end of the gym. They flung the doors inward and went into the hallway that led behind the stage. They closed the doors shut and both put their backs against the hard metal. They each took a moment to catch their breath. "What the fuck is going on?" Paxton said out loud. Half of it was directed toward Manny, the other half to whatever deity may be listening. Manny gave him a strange look. "What's with I'm a fucking youth pastor, not a saint, and I'd say the situation calls for an F-bomb or two." Manny nodded with respect. "I'd fucking say so." Both of them laughed a little, more nervous and exhausted from the stress than they were put under. Oh, they were just put under. Either way, it was a good way for both of the men to ease up a little and assess the situation better. "We better get a plan together fast, though. These doors will open whenever one of them pushes it," Manny informed Paxton. Paxton took a look at the doors. He was right. The doors had a handle on his side. On the other side, they were just in. On the other side, they were just in. The side where those soulless monsters wandered had a push bar that would open the door as soon as they walked into it. "Do you have the keys? Let's lock it up." Manny shook his head, slightly disappointed. "Nah. Set them down to get all the blankets. The shit hit the fan, and I didn't think to grab them. They're still in the gym." Paxton sighed in despair. Before he could say anything else, he heard weeping come from down wisdom from the loyal maintenance man. He looked back at him with a blank expression and shrugged. I think this is your department, boss. When it comes to the holy man upstairs, I'm just another pawn in the scheme. Paxton nodded patiently, yet inside he was screaming. He had no idea what to tell the kid. This wasn't anything he'd read about in the Bible. Sure, it seemed like some sort of apocalypse, but he didn't think this was the second coming, and if it was, it sure was a kick in the nuts that he was still here. No, this wasn't anything like that. It's okay, Jeff. We're gonna get out of here. Paxton knelt down next to Jeff and put his arms across the boy's shoulders. Even though Jeff looked like he was probably in peak shape, and he had more energy than Paxton would ever have again from his age, he was still a kid. I don't know what's happening, but the three of us will get out of here and figure it out. What about my mom and dad? Jeff asked. We'll get out of here and take you there. They are fine, okay? Don't worry about that. First, let's just get out of here. Jeff sniffed and wiped his face off. Okay, yeah. He grabbed Paxton's hand and they stood together. So let's get out of here, yeah? Paxton asked, looking for Manny's approval. Yeah, if we go out these doors, it'll take us around the side of the gym, and then we can run out and get to the east parking lot. Paxton looked at Jeff, who looked like he was ready to go. Alright, we go out here, then we get to the parking lot, and get out of here. I'll drop. Paxton just realized he didn't park in the east parking lot. He was in the west parking lot. What's wrong? I'm not parked there. You have a car there. We'll take my car, Jeff said. Paxton exhaled a sigh of relief. Okay, we ready? The three of them nodded. Jeff pulled out his keys, jingling in his hand as they shook from nerves. It's the red Cavalier in the back of the lot. Paxton grabbed the push bar and gave a nod. He swung the door open and was the first to make it outside. The other two followed. Outside, the lights shone from the exteriors of the building. It seemed quiet where they were at, considering what they had just come from. The entire area of the side of the building was empty, not a single person or monster roaming around. This way, Manny whispered to Paxton, pointing to the corner at his right. Paxton crept to the edge of the wall where he heard it, the moaning, the groaning, the chomping, the smacking of wet lips. It was so much noise he couldn't believe he didn't hear it first thing when they got out of the hallway. He peeked around the corner and saw it all. There were so many of them. He should have known. He knew exactly how many kids have shown up for the event tonight, but he had hoped most of them filtered into the building behind him. Maybe they had and come back out, or maybe there were just as many of them that stayed outside. Either way, it wasn't going to be easy. Okay, I did hit record. Oh man. The mass of what used to be teenagers and students, along with Frank and Tom roaming around, was intimidating. He saw Frank, his loyal go-to guy, drooling while aimlessly wandering. He deserved better than whatever had happened to him. Paxton looked up at the sky as he took a deep breath, putting his back against the wall. How's it look? Jeff asked, hope in his voice. Paxton shook his head. We'll make it, Manny said, peeking around Paxton at the crowd. Everyone will just have to follow me. Manny faced the two men and pointed along the wall. We'll have to keep along the wall right up until the canopy begins. He pointed up, imagining the front of the building. Once we get there, we'll make a straight path to the parking lot. It'll be the quickest way, and yeah, it's straight through them. Just move quick and with purpose. Don't dick around. Paxton had renewed confidence after Manny's walkthrough. Even if he didn't know what was going on, Paxton was sure that Manny could get them to it. Have the keys ready. Let's hit it, Manny whispered before disappearing around the corner. Paxton was glad he didn't freeze up. He grabbed Jeff, just in case he did, though. The two of them turned the corner and faced the mob of teens. The lips smacking grew louder as they noticed the men at the corner. Paxton and Jeff were right on Manny's heels as they departed the wall. So far, so good, Paxton thought. Manny's plan was working, and they were making a straight line to the parking as they squeezed through the crowd. It started to get tight. He was getting worried because there was very little space between any of the crowd. The monsters began to close in. They were so close. Paxton could feel the wet smacking and hot breath on the back of his neck, perhaps more imagined than true, but still enough to scare him. Paxton watched it happen. It was like a slow motion recap to some sort of event on a sports show, but it was happening right in front of him. Manny was sliding through a group of what were once a popular clique of teens. When one of them reached out, it grabbed onto Manny's shoulder and he began to pull away. He knocked one of the others down and it grabbed his ankle. Manny twisted around and fell to the ground. The look on Manny's face turned from determined and solid to straight panic. The chomping teeth began clicking and clacking as their heads neared any part of Manny's body they could get to. It was as if, out of nowhere, they all noticed the three men trying to escape. All eyes, empty or not, were on them. Paxton quickly looked around and grabbed Manny's leg. "Grab his other leg," Paxton shouted to Jeff. Jeff grabbed his leg as Manny cried out in pain. The twist from the fall had injured an ankle. But that was the least of anyone's worries right now. They dragged Manny through the crowd and put him against the wall of the children's ministry. The plan was bust. There was no gap in the sea of monsters anymore. Even if there were, he didn't know if Manny could make it, and they couldn't leave him behind. Manny began to stand, but kept most of his weight off his left ankle. The man was hurt, but didn't say a word about it. Instead, he only gritted his teeth and looked the incoming threat right in the eyes. "What do we do?" Jeff asked, beginning to breathe faster. Manny didn't answer. Instead, he looked ready for a fight, one he would surely lose. Paxton opened his mouth, but just let his jaw hang. He had no answer. They were getting closer, slowly making their way toward him. Was he going to see his wife again? That's all he could think of. Before anyone else could talk, the 5 soulless teens to his left disappeared. A loud crash occurred. Paxton had little time to realize what had happened. A car plowed into the crowd that prevented Paxton and crew from going anywhere. The car's engine sputtered out as the teens' bodies were caught under the tires, and a few began to rise from the ground, feet away from where they were thrown. The crowd of the Soulless hadn't dispersed from surrounding them on the other sides, but there was a small path open to get into the children's